Hey Wargamers, recently Games Workshop released a new set of rule updates for Warhammer 40,000, and it has some pretty significant implications for how the game is played, especially for our friends, the Tau Empire. So that is what we are going to be talking about today, is how this rule update and associated point changes affects the Tau Empire. And that means doing a little bit of Math Hammer, a little bit of just discussion, and in general, having an in-depth look at this newest iteration of the Tau Empire Codex. Right, so this update is basically comprised of two different parts, the point changes and the rules changes. The points changes are in the Munitorum Field Manual 2022 Mark II. Hopefully that's enough twos for you in there. But that document used to be a physical book that you had to buy. It came with the chapter approved that they would release. And now they're shifting towards something that it always should have been, which is a free PDF download, right? Which is just an absolutely awesome change. Is something like they should have been doing for years at this point. I'm glad that they are doing that again now here. But there are some pretty big changes in it for the Tau, including changes to crisis suits and broadsides and commanders and ethereals and storm surges. All those things got hit with the nerf bat with point increases. So we're going to have a lot to talk about with those units in particular. The second part is the balanced data slate for Q3 2022, so third quarter 2022. And that is normally one of the places where you would expect the more substantial changes in terms of how the army functions, but today, this time, we didn't get anything. They left the Tau exactly as they were since the last update. So no changes to how Monka works, no changes to whether or not broadsides are core. Both of those changes that they've made in the past are now persisting into the foreseeable future. So they're not going to be stepping back on Monka. They're not going to be stepping back on broadsides, despite the pretty significant point changes that they have made in this Munitorum Field Manual this time around. So that's worth noting that they're really sticking to their guns on that, which is a little, maybe a little bit too far in the other direction, but it is what it is. So let's talk about those point changes, though. Let's take a look at those point changes and see what they mean for your army. So I think about the point increases in this update as kind of falling into one of two categories. There are some point changes that they are making that really are just taxes on top of things that you are going to take almost regardless of how much they cost, right? There's limits to that, of course, but the things that they're hitting in this category are things that are just good, and they're adjusting their points up in order to thin your army out a little bit, right? Not make your 2,000 points or whatever go as far as they could, and that's just kind of the way it is, right? So the Ethereal, Unva, Unshi, those all went up by 20 points. That's a pretty notable increase given their cost, but it's not going to make me not take an Ethereal, for example, right? And the fact that both Unva and Unshi also went up by 20 points, it really doesn't change anything for how you're going to be building your army. Commanders, all versions of commanders went up by 10 points. Kind of the same deal, right? Like, you're going to take a commander, now you just have to pay 10 more points for it. That's one fewer drones that you can take. That's not great, but you're going to do it anyway, right? Iridium on crisis suits, 5 more points, so it's 10 points now instead of just 5. Yeah, I mean, that really wasn't the thing that was making me do it either way, right? So I'm probably still going to go with Iridium as just something that you do when you take a crisis suit unit. Gun drones, shield drones both went up by 2 or 3 points respectively. And that too is something that is really just changing the amount of drones or the total number of models that you can take in your army. I don't see either of these point changes changing the way that I build my army from a philosophical or strategic standpoint, right? I'm not going to stop using shield drones just because they're 3 points more now. I don't think that the math is really there to support that. If they were 10 points more, absolutely, I would start considering alternatives. But 3 points more, I think, is still in line with their general value that I'll keep using them. On the other hand, there are points changes here that really are going to make you consider how you load out certain units, or how many units you're going to take, or how you are going to build your list as a whole. And those point increases can be seen particularly in the crisis teams, right? So crisis teams went up by 10 points per model. For a baseline 30-point model to go up to 40 points, that's a 33% increase, and that's pretty dang significant, right? That's a pretty heavy hit in terms of the base cost of the model. And if we look at the types of army lists that we've been using since the Codex has been released, it's been Crisis Suit City, right? And so if you're taking this 10-point increase per model across an entire army, that adds up, and it adds up pretty quick. So it does push crisis suits in a way that you might want to consider alternatives, or maybe you just can't bring as many crisis suits as you could before, right? And so that's an impactful change. It's a 33% increase over the base cost, right? That's pretty big. So that's something that we're going to be talking about at length today. Plasma rifles too. Plasma rifles went up 5 points per iteration. So it's 10, 15, or 20 points for your first, second, or third plasma rifle now. And that's really impactful because plasma rifles are a weapon that I celebrated when the Codex was released, right? I was so excited that plasma rifles were finally in a place of reverence. They were a highly effective weapon and an efficient weapon compared to their more recent history of just being in the gutter. So the way that the plasma rifle functioned with the Codex release was really awesome, and you saw lots of plasma rifles as a result of that. Now it's being pushed to be much more comparable to the fusion blaster, which is the closest comparison we can make with any other weapon. The plasma rifle and the fusion blaster are now pretty comparably priced and really illustrate a trade-off between stability versus variability in damage output. The plasma rifle has longer range, more consistent output, whereas the fusion blaster has shorter range and has variable output. So really your choices here are, do you want to have something that can swing at close range, right, in the case of the fusion blaster, or do you want something that's a little bit safer, a little bit more reliable, and that's going to be the plasma rifle. So they've really kind of pushed this to be more of a choice and less so of one being clearly superior to the other in most cases, which you could view as being a positive thing for the game, but you could also look at that as a negative thing in the way that plasma rifles aren't as cool as they used to be now, which makes me sad. Airburst fragmentation projectors also got the same increase of 5, so they're 10, 15, or 20 now for your first, second, or third, and this is a change that's practically irrelevant, right? Because with the way that indirect fire has been changed in the previous rules update, you really don't want to take airburst fragmentation projectors anymore. So I mean, you can take them, and they still perform fairly well with direct line of sight, but that's not why you're bringing AFP to begin with. So, okay, great. I'll take that, I guess. Bodyguard's got a 5-point increase as well. And this is interesting in the way that it makes bodyguards and crisis suits both cost the same now. So it used to be that bodyguards were 5 points more than crisis suits. Now they are the same price because now they are both 40 as opposed to 30 versus 35. And that's an interesting thing because it really does, again, illustrate a trade-off now. You can either have a crisis suit that gets a free support system, or you can take a bodyguard that has a slightly better profile and has the bodyguard rule, which is now neutered, but doesn't have a free support system. So, there's this trade-off here, but bodyguards are pretty ineffective. They're just not something that you're going to want to choose to bring in a lot of cases. And so, it would almost make more sense to me that they would increase the cost of crisis suits by 10 points to make them 40 and then leave bodyguards down at 35. That would have made more sense to me because then you would have had a slight incentive to actually bring bodyguards as opposed to the crisis suit, which is just going to be a better shooting platform in most cases, almost all cases, right? So there's that. They increased it by 5 points, but it's again, kind of like the AFP, not necessarily a relevant change. Broadsides went up by 10 points, not just 5. And this is, maybe we could have put this more in the first category where it's really just more of a tax, but broadsides going up by 10 points They're still really efficient, and we'll see that when we get to the math hammer here, just as they were before. But I really would have hoped that they would have stayed the same, or gone down in price because of the loss of the core keyword. So, okay, they go up by 10 points. They're still efficient, and you're not going to be bringing that many of them, right? Because they lost core, they're not something that you're going to be taking 9 of in a list, for example. So 10 points, not really changing a whole lot for me. Again, it's just, maybe I'm taking 1 fewer drones, right? That sort of thing. So it's a change in your list, but not one that's necessarily paradigm shifting. Storm Surges went up by 70 points, which, is clearly more than anything else that we talked about, but that pushes them from being 330 to 400 points base now. And again, it just penalizes you for bringing a Storm Surge more. And that's an interesting change in the way that the changes to crisis suits in particular make things like the Storm Surge a little bit more appealing. And so I think they're just trying to keep the Storm Surge in line with that and not have kind of this power vacuum where the Storm Surge suddenly becomes the go-to thing because it has this inflated points efficiency because the points efficiency of everything else has been suppressed, or rather some of the more important units has been suppressed. All right, so as a starting point then to kind of understand how these changes influence your army composition, let's do some math hammer. Let's do some basic math here. I know. And so we're going to be calculating the offensive point efficiency of every unit in the codex, right? I've done this multiple times now. Check out my earlier videos if you want to see what this looked like in earlier stages of the codex or whatever. But this is just basic calculations, right? It's not Warhammer, it's Math Hammer. And those things are not the same, right? These are at best gross simulations, but really just a tool that helps us evaluate one small element of the game. And so there's more to the game than just these statistics, more than just these values. There's other things to consider too in terms of what makes a unit, quote unquote, good, right? Including like their defensive ability, right? How durable they are, how long they stay on the tabletop, their mobility, their range, their special rules, the buffs that they give to other units, right? All those things are equally, if not more important than their offensive point efficiency. So don't take this as gospel, right? This is just one thing that you can use to help start thinking about where to go next. These calculations I'm going to run under 2 different scenarios. So I will run them first kind of as a baseline where I assume like rapid fire range, but not a lot else, right? So it's basically just take things as they are. And then I will run them again, assuming that we're within range for Melta and we're using overcharge on ion weapons and stuff like that, right? So there's kind of the baseline and then the more intense version of things, because that does make a difference, particularly when we're talking about using fusion blasters or cyclic ion blasters against large multi-wound models. So I'll run those 2 sets and I'll point out the changes where they are relevant. I'm not going to account for rules interactions or buffs, right? I'm not accounting for Armor of Contempt or Master of War or Marker Lights or anything like that. Those things have some variability on how they impact the calculations, right? Like Armor of Contempt, for example, has no impact on like flamers, but a pretty big impact on cyclic ion blasters, for example. So you see some changing in ranking because of that, but in general, I'm just trying to take a first stab at it here. So we're not dealing with that sort of specificity. And then I will present to you in this video the top 6 units, again, out of the entire codex for each target. So I have a bunch of different targets that we'll be calculating the offensive point efficiency against. And my spreadsheet has every unit in the codex with a bunch of different variations. For example, I have like 700 crisis suit versions in the calculation. So it's pretty comprehensive. And again, this is just a useful tool that we can use to start thinking about the list. It's not the end-all be-all, but it does give us an idea of which units give the biggest punch for their cost, right? And that's something you might want to consider in terms of just how much damage you can put out in a turn or over the course of a game. So it helps us illustrate some trade-offs in the codex between units that we know are good based on their data slate, like looking at their rules, for example, right? Who wants to do that? Who wants to look at rules, right? But if you look at their data sheet and you say, okay, hey, this thing does all these really cool things, and then it also turns out that it's really efficient in this calculation, that's a good indicator that that is something worth your attention. If there's a unit that has a really attractive data sheet, but isn't efficient, then that requires a little bit more strategy, a little bit more thought on your part about whether or not that unit really fits into your list and how effective it can be. And then there are units that don't look good on paper, right? Their data sheet doesn't look very good, and they also aren't efficient in the calculations. And those are things that you just don't spend your time with, right? So there's these three different categories of units, and so by doing this calculation, we can help figure out which units fit into each of those buckets. Okay, so I'm going to break this down into kind of groups of 3 or 2 sometimes, different groups of targets, right? So the first one we're going to look at is infantry, or kind of Xenos infantry if you want. And so this starts off with a toughness 3, 5-up save, 1 wound target. And the top 6 units against that include crisis suits with just flamers or flamers and burst cannons, breachers, especially if they're at close range, pathfinders with ion rifles. And this is just calculating the Pathfinder with ion rifle itself, not the entire unit. But if we do this kind of at the unit scale, including all those kind of extra Pathfinders, it still turns out to be highly efficient. So Pathfinders with ion rifles still show up very favorably here. A Cold Star with a high output burst cannon also comes in at number 4 here, and the specific loadout for that is the burst cannon, 2 flamers, and then just a standard burst cannon as well. So obviously a really high volume output unit there. Then we have Kroot, especially if they're within rapid fire range, and then strike teams also within rapid fire range. So really kind of the typical suspects here for toughness 3, 5-up save, 1 wound targets. For toughness 4, 3-up save, 1 wound targets, we have a similar grouping of units, right? We have Pathfinders with Ion, Breachers, we have Vespid showing up here as being highly efficient, and that's something that you will see kind of these top 3 show up pretty consistently throughout this video. Crisis suits with Flamers or Flamers and Burst Cannons, Strike teams, that same Cold Star with a high output burst cannon, 2 flamers, and a burst cannon shows up as well, rounding out our top 6. And then for toughness 5, a 6-up save, and 1 wound, we have the Breachers. We have crisis suits with flamers or flamers and burst cannons. We have that high output burst cannon Cold Star. We have strike teams, gun drones, and then Piranha actually shows up here too, which is interesting. That the Piranha really hasn't been a feature in any of our earlier videos doing this type of calculation. It shows up here, not because anything happened to the Piranha, right? But because the other units that you wanted to use against this just got kicked in the teeth. So Piranha shows up here as being one of the better choices against this particular profile. But spoiler alert, you're not going to see it again on the video. A note, of course, is that in this calculation and all the other ones that we have going forward, crisis suits and bodyguards are now identical, right? So when I say crisis suits, it is true for crisis suits, but also for bodyguards. They are equally point efficient in these calculations because I'm not considering support systems. I'm not doing anything with like the bodyguard rule or anything. So they're functionally interchangeable at kind of this coarse scale. That doesn't mean that you want to use bodyguards as much as you do crisis suits now. Of course not. Again, you have to consider the other things like support systems, right? Like you get a free support system with a crisis suit, and that's really awesome. So I think that's a pretty significant indicator that crisis suits are going to be the better choice most of the time. But nonetheless, on these calculations, they are interchangeable. So the next slate of targets are generally Marine profiles. And again, this isn't accounting for Armor of Contempt or anything like that. And these are profiles where we start to see a difference between scenarios where we allow for Melta and Overcharge and scenarios where we don't. So first we'll look here at the standard baseline scenario. With Toughness 4, 3 up save, 2 wounds, we see Pathfinders, this time with either rail rifles or ion rifles, are both highly efficient. Vespid, Breachers, the Cold Star shows up here again. The high output burst cannon, 2 missile pods, and a plasma rifle is the loadout for that guy. Hammerheads with an ion cannon show up. And then the broadsides with the heavy rail rifle. And this may not surprise you to know that broadsides with a heavy rail rifle are going to be really highly point sufficient. They're more so with a plasma rifle. So when we see the heavy rail rifle thing here, that's also being bundled with a plasma rifle for the broadside. But yeah, whether or not you take a plasma rifle or a smart missile system, that generally falls more into the realm of strategy, more so than pure math hammer. So, take that as you will. All right, moving on to Toughness 5, 3 up save, 3 wounds. We have Pathfinders, again, with rail or ion rifles. Either one are highly efficient. Vespid, Breachers, broadside with a heavy rail rifle. Storm Surge with a pulse driver cannon shows up. And again, this is something that should be clarified. When I say the Storm Surge with the pulse driver cannon, I'm not just talking about the driver cannon itself. I'm talking about the entire model. So all of the weapon systems on the Storm Surge firing at a single target, and that includes like 1 destroyer missile. So all those weapons firing at a single target does turn out to be pretty point efficient in this case. But it's not just the driver cannon. I want to be clear about that. And then we have the Hammerhead with a railgun as well. For Toughness 5, 2 up save, 5 wounds. Pathfinders with rail or ion. Vespid. Broadsides with heavy rail rifle. Hammerhead with a railgun. Breachers. Storm Surge with the driver cannon. Hey, look. We're starting to see a pattern, aren't we? So we have very consistent unit choices against Marines here. Not all of them are going to be things that you automatically want to take, right? Like you may or may not want to take Pathfinders based on the way your army is functioning. You may or may not want to take Vespid or a Storm Surge, depending on how your army is composed. But on paper, these are the things that are giving you the best bang for your buck, given the best scenario possible for them, right? So there's not behind cover, they're not dealing with modifiers or anything like that, right? Just on paper. Now, if we rerun these calculations but allow for Melta range or overcharging cyclic ion blasters, then we see a few other units pop into the list here. For Toughness 4 with a 3 up save and 2 wounds, we see the Commander with either 4 cyclic ion blasters, again being overcharged, or 3 cyclic ion blasters, and then basically whatever else you want, being pretty efficient. We also see Crisis suits with 2 cyclic ion blasters and a flamer show up here, and then Forcer suits with 3 or 4 cyclic ion blasters show up as well. And this is kind of a pretty consistent thing for the rest of the video, that you'll see the XVA Commander pop in, and then a few spaces down, then Forcer will pop in below it, because they're just slightly different point cost, right? The differences between the different Commander suits are more rules based than point based. For the Toughness 5, 3 up save, 3 wounds, we see the Commander with cyclic ion blasters and Crisis with plasma rifle, fusion blasters, and cyclic ion blasters. So the 1-2-3 combo there show up as being pretty efficient as well. And this is something that I think is probably a pretty good loadout for Crisis suits moving forward, is the one of each kind of loadout there. Toughness 5, 2 up save, 5 wounds. We see, again, the Cyclic Ion Blaster XVA Commander, and then 2 Fusion Blasters and a Cyclic Ion Blaster loadout for Crisis suits being very favorable as well. Looking at unit profiles that are kind of more like smaller vehicles, we have a Toughness 5, 4 up save with 6 wounds. We see Pathfinders with Railer Ion, Vespid, Breachers actually still being really efficient here, just because of the number of shots that you can get out for the points. Hammerhead with a railgun, Broadside with the heavy rail rifle, and the Storm Surge with the pulse blast cannon showing up here as well. Toughness 6, 4 up save, 12 wounds. We have Pathfinders with Railer Ion, Hammerhead with a railgun, Broadside with heavy rail rifles, Storm Surge with the blast cannon, Vespid, and then Crisis suits with a fusion blaster, missile pod, and a flamer rounding out the top 6 against that target. And this is something that showed up fairly common in these calculations, as we would see like crisis suits with 2 weapons that you would expect and then a flamer. And I think it really is just that the flamer isn't doing that much work, but it's cheap, right? And so that's the big thing, is that we're trying to keep the cost of these suits down. And so oftentimes like 2 weapons that you actually want and then a flamer tends to be a pretty good choice. Toughness 7, 3-up save, 12 wounds. Pathfinders with rail or ion, broadside with heavy rail rifle, hammerhead with railgun, storm surge with blast cannon, Vespid, and then a commander with 2 plasma rifles and 2 fusion blasters, rounding out the top 6 against that type of target. Now, if we allow for melt or overcharge, we see commanders with 2 fusion blasters and 2 cyclic ion blasters show up as good units for toughness 5 with a 4-up save and 6 wounds. Against that target, we also see crisis suits with 2 fusion blasters and cyclic ion blaster being effective as well. For toughness 6, a 4-up save, 12 wounds, we see, again, commanders with 2 fusion blasters, 2 cyclic ion blasters. We see crisis with 2 fusion blasters and a cyclic ion blaster, and a enforcer as well with fusion blasters and cyclic ion blasters, right? Again, kind of the same story, right? We're seeing this pattern of, if you allow for Melta and overcharge, you see fusion blaster, cyclic ion blaster combos be very effective. Otherwise, we don't see a lot of these units in the top 6. Toughness 7, 3-up save, 12 wounds. Crisis with fusion and cyclic. Commander with fusion and cyclic. Enforcer with fusion and cyclic. In this case, we actually see a little bit more of a preference for having more of the fusion and less of the cyclic. It's not quite the even exchange that we had before, but still, it's a variation on a theme, right? Fusion and cyclic. Moving on to larger targets without melt or overcharge. So toughness 8, 3-up save, 12 wounds, or toughness 8 with a 2-up save and 16 wounds. These basically worked out to be exactly the same, so I'm just lumping them together here. Pathfinders with rail or ion, broadside with heavy rail rifle, hammerhead with railgun, storm surge with whatever weapon you want. Vespid, and then a commander with 2 fusion blasters and 2 plasma rifles round out the top 6 against those targets. Against toughness 8, 3-up save, 24 wounds, and a 5++, so a 5-up invulnerable save. Looking at unites, we see Pathfinders with rail or ion, hammerheads with a railgun, broadsides with heavy rail rifle, Vespid, storm surge with the blast cannon, and then Skyrays. Skyrays show up here, which is kind of cool. I'm glad to see Skyrays on the list. If we allow for Melta overcharge, we see crisis suits with 2 fusion blasters and a cyclic ion blaster, and then commanders with a 3 fusion blaster, 1 cyclic ion blaster loadout for the smaller guys there, and then for the knight profile, commanders with 3 cyclic ion blasters and a fusion blaster showed up there as well. Okay. All right, so then if we look at smaller units that have invulnerable saves, so these are infantry that have some sort of invulnerable save, we see a lot of the same units show up, but there's more room for those low AP, no AP loadouts to shine here because their AP doesn't really matter as much. So crisis suits with flamers and burst cannons, Kroot, cold stars with high output burst cannon, XVA commanders with flamers or flamers and burst cannons, breachers, enforcers with flamers or flamers and burst cannons. Those are all highly efficient choices. Then for toughness 4 with a 3-up save, 2 wounds, and a 4++, we have Pathfinders show back up. Vespid, crisis suits with flamers or flamers and burst cannons. Strike teams, hammerheads with railgun, and cold stars with high output burst cannon also show up. And then finally, if we look at things that are larger with invulnerable saves, aside from that knight profile we looked at earlier, we see that toughness 6, 3-up save, 8 wounds, 5++. Pathfinders with rail or ion, again, are very strong here. Hammerheads with a railgun, broadsides with heavy rail rifles, storm surges with the blast cannon, Vespid, commanders with 2 missile pods, a fusion blaster, and a plasma rifle, round out the top 6 there. For toughness 7, a 3-up save, 12 wounds, and a 4++. We're talking about Pathfinders and hammerheads and broadsides and storm surges and crisis suits with 2 flamers and a fusion blaster, right? Like, that loadout is kind of weird, right? That's something that probably I wouldn't take in real life, but on paper it works. 2 flamers and a fusion blaster are pretty different things, but yeah, it's one of those things where you really are doing this for the volume of fire and then the chance of getting some nice wounds here with a fusion blaster, I guess. And then Vespid, right? Vespid still perform very well because they have decent strength and damage output. If we allow for Melta and Overcharge, we see commanders with 3 or 4 cyclic ion blasters showing up, crisis suits with the fusion blaster, missile pod, cyclic ion blaster loadout, and that's pretty similar to the one we talked about earlier. Here we're seeing missile pods instead of plasma rifles, but the plasma rifle version of this, so fusion blaster, plasma rifle, cyclic ion blaster, was similar in efficiency as well. So missile pod, plasma rifle, you're probably fine either way. Enforcer with 3 or 4 cyclic ion blasters, and again, for these commander loadouts that have 3 or 4 cyclic ion blasters, it's either 4 cyclic ion blasters or 3 cyclic ion blasters, plus really whatever you want. Like, that extra weapon doesn't change things very much. And then broadside, we already talked about broadsides, right? We're talking about the new things. So looking at toughness 7 with a 3-up save, 12 wounds, and 4++, we see that crisis suits with a fusion blaster, cyclic ion blaster, and a flamer show up here as well. And again, this is another illustration of that flamer just being there to maybe go through, but really just keep the price down. Commanders, 3 cyclic ion blasters and a fusion blaster, and then enforcers with 3 cyclic ion blasters and a fusion blaster as well. Whew, all right. That was a lot. So I'm glad we did. I'm glad I did the calculations. I'm glad we talked about it. Hopefully you're glad you heard it, but I don't think any of us need to do that again. It was a lot of the same, right? It was a lot of the same units again and again and again in a slightly different order. And in the past when we've done this video, that's been somewhat true, right? That the same thing's showing up over and over again, but it was a little bit more versatile last time. And what's really important is that in the past, one of the units that we saw consistently was crisis suits, and that is not the case any longer. Crisis suits were not one of the units that we saw pop up over and over again, and that's kind of a bummer, right? That crisis suits used to be one of the best choices you could take, and you could tailor them to the target, which made them really kind of feel more like multiple units, right? You could have your anti-infantry unit, you can have your anti-vehicle unit, you can have all these different loadouts in your list, and that felt cool and thematic, and it's something that fans of the Codex, fans of Tau Empire have always wanted in their army, right? We've always loved crisis suits. They are a staple, they are iconic for the faction, but they have not always performed that way, and in this Codex, they did, right? They were that good, that you want to have an army with ample crisis suits in them. But that's not the case anymore, right? I think this, along with other pretty significant changes to the Codex, suggests that the age of the crisis suit is over, right? At least for now. At least for now, we're not going to be building armies entirely around crisis suits the way that some of us would like to. And that's okay, right? There are still places where crisis suits are a competitive choice on paper, right? And again, this is not including things like, Master of War or other buffs or stratagems or anything like that, right? This is just a really simple calculation. So it's not the end all be all. But even just taking this kind of first glance look, there are places where crisis suits do perform well, right? We see that like 2 flamer and a burst cannon crisis suit, or fusion blaster, cyclic ion blaster, plasma rifle suits, or just, fusion blaster, cyclic ion blaster suits do well in a few places too. So there are places where crisis suits do retain some of their relative efficiency compared to other choices in the Codex, which is good, right? It does give them a place in the army list. But it's not as ubiquitous as it was before. You're not going to be bringing crisis suits to do multiple jobs. You're going to be bringing one or two units to do a couple different jobs maybe in your list, not building your list entirely around crisis suits. So you're going to be using them in moderation. You're not going to be spamming crisis suits, and you're going to have smaller armies. You're going to have fewer suits in that army. You're going to have fewer drones in that army to keep those suits on the table, because again, you're going to be using up more points to field those suits, and you're also going to be using up more points to field any drones. So it's just going to be less, right? It's going to be less of what we had before. And as a consequence of that, we see things like commanders returning as one of the more efficient picks. And in the past, commanders weren't that efficient. In fact, they were pretty inefficient relative to things like crisis suits, because they had good output, but they were expensive. And now, with again a 33% increase base on crisis suits, that pushes them way out of sync with commanders. And so commanders return as this more efficient pick relative to crisis suits, which is boring. It's boring, right? That doesn't feel good, because commanders are already a pretty favored choice, right? They do something really critical for your army in terms of buffing and providing utility to crisis suits or other units. So they are really this thing that you're going to be bringing anyway. And so making them relatively stronger compared to crisis suits is boring. It's not fun. And so that's disappointing. For commanders, though, right, they are super limited. So even though they are so efficient, you're probably only going to be bringing one or maybe two if you're playing Farsight per list, right? Like, you're just not going to be able to bring more commanders. So them being one of the more efficient picks isn't necessarily very helpful, because you can only bring one per detachment, or two if you're playing Farsight. And given the changes to how CP works, you're only going to be bringing one detachment probably, right? Like, you're really going to have to be stretching if you want to bring multiple detachments. So by and large, you're going to be seeing one commander on the table, and then you're going to be looking at all these other choices for the rest of your army, and crisis suits just aren't going to be the main thing that you're looking at in most cases. So crisis suits still are viable. They're not going to be the dominant component of your list. You're going to bring one or two units, pair it with a commander, and call it good. And then the rest of your army is going to be something else. And I think probably what that is going to be is largely one of two things. It's either going to be like a mechanized list with hammerheads and maybe some skyrays, but definitely like breachers and devilfish, right? If we kind of look at more of like a Fish of Fury approach, that is relatively more viable now, right? And again, it's not that breachers got better, it's that crisis suits got worse. It's not that hammerheads got better, it's that broadsides got worse. So, we see that hammerheads, breachers, sometimes strike teams, sometimes skyrays, all of those perform pretty well. But certainly breachers and hammerheads were consistently in our list, right? No matter what the target was, having like mortal wound generation on hammerheads meant that they were able to dish out a fair amount of damage. And then having the option to use the submunition stratagem gives them a lot more versatility. And so hammerheads do come out favorably in this. They still suffer from the same weaknesses from before, though, right? There's still just one model that can be pretty easily removed from the tabletop. So again, that's a part where we have to think more about the context of this analysis aside from just what's on paper. So, that's something for another video perhaps. But right, hammerheads, breachers, strike teams, they all perform pretty well. And so I think moving towards a more mechanized list is probably something you're going to see more often, because we do retain the synergy of breachers and strike teams with other units, like the Fireblade, for example. We are still able to use a bunch of stratagems on them. So like, they can do a lot of work, just as they were doing before, but now there isn't a clear, better alternative to those. So you're going to see them more. The other kind of archetype that we might be leaning more into now too is auxiliaries. Vespid did very well across the board. And that's been true before, right? That Vespid have always shown up as one of the better choices on paper here. And even though they are relatively static, they don't interact very well. So maybe the word inert would be better. Vespid are the noble gas of the army, I suppose. But yeah, they're relatively inert in the way that they just don't synergize with a lot of things, right? Just like broadsides, right? Vespid, broadsides, both of them are really strong picks on paper. They just don't synergize. So they can be kind of taken at face value. They are exactly what they look like on the data sheet. They don't have a lot of hidden tricks or anything in them, but they're still good, right? They're still very efficient at dealing damage, and perhaps some of that inertness is a asset in the way that it doesn't rely on having other units around, right? You don't have to have these other units around in order to use them to their maximum benefit. And so, you've built in some stability in your list in that way as well. So Vespid and also Kroot showed up a few times, right? So maybe moving more towards these auxiliary archetype lists is something that is worth another look, particularly if you're looking to play Dalith. The downside of that, of course, the Dalith Septenna allowing your crew to use your tactical philosophy is a little less potent, right? Because one of the really cool things about playing Dalith was that you could get your crew to benefit from Mon-Ka, and that was a massive force multiplier for them. Can't do that. Well, I mean, you can do that, but they just don't have the same benefit anymore. So it's just not as good as it was, unfortunately. But still, I think this warrants a closer look and maybe will result in seeing more auxiliaries on the table because, again, they are self-sufficient and will offer pretty good damage output for their price on the tabletop. So all that said, right, we're seeing that crisis suits are still viable, just not as much, right? They're not ubiquitous. They're not your main pick anymore. And we're seeing commanders, yeah, they offer a lot of damage for their price, but they're limited, kind of artificially, right? And then the auxiliaries and the mechanized lists both come out relatively well in that comparison because the things that otherwise would outshine them are now not as good. So what that all means is that I think we'll see smaller armies, certainly because of these point increases, but also more diverse armies, right? We're not going to see just crisis suits, right? We're going to see lists that have crisis suits in them, have broadsides in them, perhaps too, but also different things, right? They're going to have hammerheads and breachers or a bunch of Vespid or something like that. So it'll mix it up at least a little bit, which is interesting. But still, it's at the end of the day, it doesn't feel great to have crisis suits kind of kicked down a notch like this. I would have preferred an alternative solution that would have reined them in a little bit. This seems a little strong, but nonetheless, it is where we're at. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Did this analysis change how you're going to be viewing your army, how you're going to be constructing your army, what kind of units you're going to be bringing, or not? Let's have a conversation in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching and happy wargaming. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. This channel is made possible by my supporters over on Patreon. If you enjoyed this video, consider joining our community over there as well. Special thanks to Jack and Acker, Mate Monk, A Little Pink Monster, Durza, Ever Keller, Robbie Goodwin, Jose Gomez, Drew Pratley, Michael Burns, Zealous Brimstone, Scott Heater, Stephen Cohen, Jared Egler, Chris Kessler, and Shifty.